Hello everybody, it's a fantastic time to be a Marvel Legends collector because it seems like we're getting releases, whether they're entire waves or individual deluxe releases, almost monthly if not weekly at this point. The only problem now is whether we have enough cash to pay for everything that we want. And inevitably this is going to lead to people having to specialise and make difficult choices about which lines and which characters they're going to pick up. Now I'm delighted to be talking about the latest Iron Man themed wave, and this is nostalgia heavy, which we'll get into in a moment, but this is a really exciting wave for me and is ticking an awful lot of my boxes. And I did pick up every figure in this wave, so over a series of videos I'm going to drop an individual review of each one so you can pick and choose in the ones that you're interested in hearing me talk about. Today I'm going to start off with Iron Man Model 01, so this is the first appearance Iron Man. I have to say, this is actually kind of cool. I have never owned a first appearance Iron Man before. I've never been that struck on this costume. Of course, he wore it very, very briefly in the comic books before he transitioned over to the red and gold colouring, which he stayed with pretty much ever since. But at this point in my collection, I have so many Iron Man variants, it seemed foolish not to have his original costume in there. So I took a punt. And I'll be totally honest with you, this packaging did not hurt that decision at all. So let's start by talking about this. It is of course nostalgia heavy. This is retro carded, meaning that this is recycling artwork that we saw in the 1990s that was actually associated with the Iron Man animated series, which I grew up watching. So this is absolutely fantastic. I owned figures with these cards back in the 90s from Toy Biz, and you know, this just really tickles the nostalgia bone in a massive way. I'm very, very pleased with this artwork. I love this. I love that it's writ large now, just as we've seen with the Spider-Man animated series, and we've seen on a couple of other special releases as well, including the Fantastic Four, no less, a few years ago. I love having this, and I love being able to put these on my wall with the other retro cards I have in my collection. And up front, I'm going to have to say it, I was really unprepared for this figure because I didn't have much in the way of expectations for it. I thought it might be a little bit clunky and a bit stiff, and I was really wrong. I'm super impressed with it. Now, the first thing to acknowledge is that this is actually not really an original release. We've actually had this figure before, actually quite recently, if not only a year or two ago, where we saw it in the silver form. Obviously, this is in his golden form when he joined the Avengers. So it's basically the same release, it just has a very different colour scheme. Otherwise, everything about this is pretty similar. And that's not all, of course, because we actually have had this in the very early days of the Marvel Legends line, back when it was run by Toy Biz, where we had this slightly gawky version of the figure. Again, we could get a variant, so we can have it in either colour, silver or gold, and yeah, you know, it was a different time. I think it was quite a good figure for its time. By today's standards, it does look a little bit out of proportion and a little bit gangly, so this automatically looks like a step up. Straight off the bat, I have to say I'm really impressed with the sculpting. This looks pretty accurate to what we see on the comic book page. It is a quite a simplistic costume, so there's not an awful lot to draw out here, but I do like the little rivets around the helmet in particular, and the proportions on the mask. And we actually see Tony Stark's eyes underneath there. They're carefully painted in, which looks really good. And we can see the flesh tone there around it as well, which is, again, accurate, but very finely done as well. And I have to say, I really love the gold tones they've used on this figure, both in the plastic and in the rubber material, which is covering the sort of the chest area. It looks just spot on to me. It actually looks gold, which is brilliant. There's not much in the way of paint apps or washes running over it, but for once I don't mind that because I think this works really well for this particular character and this version of the character. It doesn't really need much in the way of shading because he is supposed to be, you know, bright metal. So I think this works really well. And where there is little bits in some of the individual grooves and rivets, it just brings out that detailing, and it looks great. So overall, I'm really pleased with this. I only have good things to say about it. I think the rubber body over the torso and this sort of skirt, for lack of a better description, works really well. All too often when toy companies try this, the two materials do not gel together very well because the colours look so different, and it usually creates a bit of a contrast which can be really off-putting to the eyes. Here it kind of blends and it works really surprisingly well. So I have to give Hasbro top marks for this. I think this looks really good. The only place where we see a little bit of inconsistency is actually on the elbow joints. You can see there's a slight discoloration, but it's such a small joint that actually it's not too noticeable. In the main, I think they've done a really nice job with the paint and the materials they've used on this figure, and I think he looked looks absolutely fantastic. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, as we will see, he does come with an alternate head, and this is of course the unmasked Tony Stark head. And yeah, I think we've seen this before. I don't think that this is a brand new sculpt. I might be wrong, but it is a classic Tony Stark, as you would expect to see in the comic books of the 60s and 70s, and it looks pretty good to me. I think this is a great sculpt, and it's got some nice paint apps on it. There's nothing really running through the hair, which is a shame, but otherwise, yeah, pretty much spot on. So let's take a look at the articulation. He does have a ball joint at the top and the bottom of the neck, so he can spin his head all the way around, and he can even wobble it left and right despite that big collarbone joint there, which is pretty cool. Now, he can't really wobble it forwards and backwards, unfortunately, but he does have ball joints in the shoulders which lift all the way up and all the way around, which is great, and he's got a bicep swivel there as well. He does have a double joint at the elbow, but really it can only hinge to about 90 degrees. And then he's got a pivot at the wrist there, allowing the hand to rotate all the way around, and of course hinge forwards and backwards. Now, we've got a ball joint in the waist which will allow him to swivel all the way around, but it'll also let him lean from left to right as well, and there's some good movement here, which is unexpected but very, very cool. He can also bend forward slightly, but he can bend backwards quite a bit. He's got ball joints in the hips which will allow the legs to kick out to the side, which is neatly disguised by the rubber skirting, and of course there's a thigh swivel at the top there. The legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards, and there is another double joint at the knee, but again, that knee's not really going to let it bend too much further back than about 45 degrees. There is an ankle pivot, so the foot will of course hinge forwards and backwards, but also rock from side to side. And if we take a look at the accessories, we'll see that this version of Iron Man is one of the ones that benefits from the most in this wave. He comes with an additional pair of open palm hands, the alternate Tony Stark head, as we've already seen, and then he also has a couple of blast effects as well, and some of those smoke rings to go around it, which is pretty nice. And to be fair, that's about all I could expect from this version of Iron Man, so I'm pretty happy with what we've got here. Now, if we take a look at these open palm hands, I was surprised that there actually isn't a peg hole in here to put the blast effects through, but then I can't really remember whether he actually fired like those pulse rays in the early days with this costume, so maybe that's not appropriate. But nevertheless, it's not there, that's not a feature, but you can stick them in the bottom of his boots to simulate that flight effect, which is pretty cool, although you're going to need some kind of holder to be able to position him in a way that this looks authentic, because obviously he can't stand freely with these on the bottom of his feet. And you know, all in all, I have to say, I'm super impressed with this figure, and I had zero expectations of it at all. So I'm really happy to give it 5 stars. I'm super impressed. There's something about this figure that's just really, really nice to look at. Maybe it's the gold colouring. The articulation is incredibly smooth in terms of those joints as well, and whilst it isn't the best, it is consistent with the version of this character that we're seeing here, what we would expect to see on the comic book page, I suppose. So it actually all works brilliantly, and what would be normally considered a limitation or a weakness of the figure actually plays as a strength here because it feels authentic. So all in all, yeah, I love this figure, and I'm really, really surprised by it. I think it's a fantastic addition to this line, and I'm really, really glad that I picked him up. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider giving the video a like. That kind of thing really does help the channel out, and it allows me to keep making more content. And if you're interested in seeing more content, remember to hit subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos coming soon.